Marie Laveau was a name whispered with reverence and fear in the streets of New Orleans, her story often half forgotten, half myth. Yet, behind the shadows of the legend lies a woman whose power and influence shaped the fate of an entire city. For centuries, she was either reduced to a ghostly figure, a symbol of supernatural prowess, or simply dismissed as part of the dark folklore of New Orleans, an echo of the past that faded over time. Her true story, however, was more complex than any myth could capture. To understand the eerie silence that surrounds Marie Laveau, we must first consider her historical context. Born in the 1790s, New Orleans was a city torn between multiple worlds. A melting pot of French, Spanish, African, and Native American cultures, it was a city where the old world collided with the new. The city was built on a foundation of slavery, where people of color, both enslaved and free, were forced to navigate a complex social system designed to keep them in their place. It was in this charged environment that Laveau was born and would come to wield influence that defied the constraints placed upon her by society. Her family background alone would have made her a curious figure. Marie Laveau was born to a mixed-race woman of African and Native American descent, and her father was a wealthy French plantation owner. As a free person of color in a slave-driven society, Laveau occupied a precarious position. She was neither fully accepted by the white elite nor entirely embraced by the enslaved African community. Yet, it was within this liminal space that she began to carve out her power. From the beginning, Laveau's life was a testament to resilience, a woman who would not be constrained by the definitions placed upon her, neither by her race nor gender. Marie Laveau's rise to prominence in New Orleans coincided with a period of great unrest. The city was divided, fractured along racial and class lines, and tensions were high. Slavery, the backbone of the Southern economy, was beginning to show signs of instability. Rebellions, both real and imagined, rippled through the city, and fears of uprisings among the enslaved population created a sense of anxiety among the white elite. In this volatile atmosphere, Laveau emerged not only as a healer and spiritual leader but also as a mediator, navigating the fractured world of New Orleans with a blend of African spiritual practices and Catholicism, a synthesis that would both elevate and mystify her. Her practices as a voodoo priestess were not just about rituals and incantations. They were deeply intertwined with the everyday lives of the people she served. For the enslaved, she was both a spiritual guide and a protector. For the free people of color, she was a figure of influence, able to bridge the gap between the oppressed and the powerful. Her rituals were often held in secret, in hidden corners of the city, away from the prying eyes of white society. But as her fame spread, so did the rumors. Those who were drawn to her power were often people who had nowhere else to turn, the outcasts, the marginalized, and the desperate. In Laveau's rituals, they found a sense of agency, a belief that they could control their fates in a world that sought to keep them powerless. Yet, Laveau's relationship with the city's elite was far from one-dimensional. While many saw her as a mere superstition, a figurehead for a dangerous practice, others recognized her power and influence. Some sought her out for protection, for guidance, or for cures to ailments that conventional medicine could not address. The rich, the poor, and the enslaved all sought her out in times of need. But as her power grew, so did the suspicion of those who saw her influence as a threat to the established order. Her ability to navigate between these disparate worlds, from the most destitute to the most powerful, made her a figure both revered and feared. In many ways, Marie Laveau was a master of the psychology of power. She understood better than most how to wield influence in a society that was both rigidly hierarchical and deeply superstitious. She understood the fears that gripped the elite and the ways in which the enslaved sought solace. Through her rituals, she was able to tap into the deep-rooted anxieties and desires of those around her, offering them something intangible, a sense of control, a belief that they were not as powerless as they appeared. But with this power came an inevitable backlash. The more Laveau's power grew, the more it attracted scrutiny, and soon, rumors about her began to spread. To the white elite, she was a threat, a symbol of the uncontrolled power of the enslaved, a reminder that the system they depended on was fragile. And to the Catholic Church, she was an affront to Christian values, an embodiment of what they saw as dangerous paganism. What they failed to realize, however, was that Laveau's practices were not solely about rebellion or resistance, they were about survival. They were about finding a way to navigate a world that sought to destroy you, to maintain your dignity in a system designed to strip it away. The historical documents we have about Marie Laveau are sparse, fragmented, and often contradictory. This absence of solid evidence only adds to the mystery surrounding her life. As time went on, the lines between the historical Laveau and the mythical figure began to blur. What was once a woman of flesh and blood slowly transformed into a symbol of dark power, a figure used by storytellers and historians to represent the hidden forces at play in New Orleans. And yet, even as her legacy was obscured by myth and rumor, there remained those who knew the truth. For many, Laveau's story was not one of darkness, but of light, of a woman who defied the odds and carved out a space for herself and others in a world determined to deny them their humanity. This juxtaposition, between the myth of Marie Laveau and the reality of her life, sets the stage for the deeper mystery that unfolds in the coming sections of this story. How is it that a woman of such profound influence and power could be erased from the historical record? How could someone who shaped the very fabric of New Orleans' spiritual and political landscape be reduced to nothing more than a whisper in the wind? These questions are not merely academic, they speak to the way history itself is written and rewritten, how those in power control the narrative, and how those who threaten that power are often cast aside or forgotten. Marie Laveau's legacy is a reminder that history is not always told by the victors, and that the truth, no matter how powerful, can be buried beneath layers of myth and silence. Through the lens of Laveau's story, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the ways in which society has marginalized certain voices, particularly the voices of women of color. It is a stark reminder that the very forces that seek to erase such voices are often the same ones that seek to control the future. The mystery of Marie Laveau is, at its core, a story of resistance, a story of a woman who, despite the odds stacked against her, managed to leave an indelible mark on the world. The question is not whether her story will be remembered, but whether we, as a society, will have the courage to uncover the hidden truths that lie beneath the surface of history. As we step deeper into the past, into the streets of New Orleans where Marie Laveau walked, we begin to see the outlines of a woman whose life was defined by the contradictions of her time. She was both a product of her environment and a force that transcended it. She was both a healer and a revolutionary. She was both a symbol of the enduring power of the oppressed and a reminder of the ways in which power is often twisted to serve the interests of the few. And as her story unfolds, we are left with a question that lingers long after the final words are spoken: what does it mean to be forgotten, and what does it take to ensure that a legacy is never truly lost? In the late 18th century, New Orleans stood as a city of contrasts, a place where the old world collided with the new, where the enslaved and the free, the powerful and the powerless, lived side by side, yet worlds apart. New Orleans, founded in 1718, was a French colony until it passed into Spanish hands in 1763, only to return to French control briefly before being sold to the United States in 1803. Each shift in sovereignty left its mark on the city, from the architecture to the social structures. At the core of it all was the undeniable truth that New Orleans, like many southern cities, was built on the backs of enslaved African labor. The plantation economy dominated the region, and the racial hierarchies that came with it permeated every aspect of life. It was against this backdrop of shifting empires and deep-rooted inequality that Marie Laveau was born, most likely in 1794, though the exact year of her birth remains uncertain. Her family's story was one that reflected the complexities of New Orleans society. Laveau's mother, Marguerite, was a free woman of color, likely of both African and Native American heritage, while her father, Charles Laveau, was a wealthy French plantation owner. This mixed-race heritage placed Marie in a precarious position within New Orleans' rigid caste system. She was not white enough to be accepted into the elite circles of the city, nor was she fully part of the enslaved population. As a free woman of color, Marie navigated a fragile space between the enslaved African population and the oppressive white elite. Her social standing as a free woman of color, while a source of some privilege, also carried significant risks. In a city where a racial caste system governed almost every aspect of daily life, Marie's existence as a mixed-race woman meant that she had to constantly negotiate her place in society. This was a world where free people of color were often subjected to harsh scrutiny, and their every move monitored by both the white elite and other marginalized groups. Slaves who were caught attempting to escape or rebel faced brutal punishments, and even free people of color, though not enslaved, were often caught in the web of racial prejudice and class warfare. Yet, within this harsh and volatile social structure, New Orleans was also a place where various cultural influences converged. The city was a melting pot of French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, and Native American cultures, each leaving its mark on the people and the city's traditions. Catholicism had a strong presence, but so did African spiritual practices, particularly those brought by enslaved people from the West African kingdoms. It was in this syncretic environment that the foundations of Marie Laveau's power were formed. In New Orleans, the intersection of African spiritual traditions with Catholicism was a unique phenomenon. Voodoo, as it came to be known, was not a single, unified religion but rather a blend of African religious practices, French Catholicism, and Native American spiritual beliefs. For enslaved Africans, Voodoo offered a sense of identity and belonging, a way to hold on to ancestral traditions in the face of brutal oppression. For free people of color, Voodoo represented a form of resistance to the dominant European culture, a way to assert their autonomy in a world that sought to deny them both physical and spiritual freedom. Marie Laveau's spiritual practices were deeply rooted in these traditions. She was not just a practitioner of Voodoo, she was a spiritual leader, a healer, and a woman of extraordinary influence. By the time she was in her 20s, Laveau had become a prominent figure in the Voodoo community of New Orleans, attracting followers from all walks of life. Her followers were not limited to the enslaved or the free people of color, many from the white elite also sought her out, drawn to her reputation as a powerful spiritual figure capable of influencing the unseen world. Laveau's rise in New Orleans society was, in many ways, a result of her ability to navigate and manipulate the city's complex social structures. Though the elite sought to suppress African spiritual practices, they were often willing to turn to those very practices in times of crisis. When it came to matters of love, health, or fortune, the wealthy turned to Marie Laveau, hoping to receive blessings or protection. It was not uncommon for both white men and women to visit her for spiritual guidance or to seek out cures for illnesses that no conventional doctor could heal. In this way, Laveau's voodoo was not merely about rebellion, it was about survival. It was a tool that allowed her to rise above her station and secure power in a society that sought to keep her marginalized. Her ability to cross social and racial boundaries was what truly set her apart. Laveau understood better than most that power was not just about wealth or status, it was about perception. She crafted an image of herself as a mysterious, powerful figure capable of both healing and harming. Her rituals, performed in private, were known for their secrecy and their ability to elicit fear and awe. She was both a spiritual leader and a political force, her influence extending far beyond the realm of religion into the streets and the corridors of power. But it was this very power that would soon begin to attract suspicion. As Laveau's reputation grew, so did the rumors that surrounded her. The white elite, already distrustful of the spiritual practices of the enslaved and free people of color, began to view her as a threat. For many, she was the embodiment of what they feared most, the unbridled power of the oppressed. Marie Laveau's influence was more than just spiritual, it was political and cultural, a direct challenge to the social order that kept the elite in power. In a city where racial tensions were high and the threat of rebellion was ever present, the white elite feared the possibility of Laveau using her power to incite unrest. The Catholic Church, too, took an interest in Laveau's practices, but for very different reasons. Church authorities saw her as a dangerous figure, one who posed a direct threat to Christian doctrine. To them, her rituals were pagan, and her influence was corrupting the faithful. Yet, despite their efforts to suppress her, Laveau's power continued to grow. The more they sought to condemn her, the more her followers rallied to her side, drawn by her magnetic presence and her promise of protection from the forces that sought to oppress them. As New Orleans began to transition from a Spanish colony to a part of the United States, the city's population grew, and with it, the tensions between the various factions within it. The slave economy was at the heart of this tension, and as more people of African descent became free, the existing social order became increasingly fragile. Marie Laveau, with her blend of spiritual and political influence, became a symbol of this instability. To the elite, she represented a challenge to their authority, a reminder that the people they had sought to keep oppressed were capable of mobilizing their own power. To the enslaved, she was a symbol of hope, a woman who had not only survived but thrived in a society that sought to crush them. Through her mastery of both the spiritual and the political, Marie Laveau carved out a unique and unprecedented place for herself in New Orleans. But it was also this very power that would ultimately lead to her erasure. As her influence continued to grow, so did the efforts to erase her from the historical record. Those who feared her began to create a new narrative, one in which she was reduced to myth, a legend of dark magic and superstition, rather than a real woman who had defied the odds and shaped the course of New Orleans history. Yet, despite the erasure of her true story, Marie Laveau's legacy endures in the city. Her name is still invoked in the corners of New Orleans, in the rituals of Voodoo practitioners, in the whispered stories of those who still seek her guidance. Even in the face of centuries of suppression, her power continues to echo through the streets of the city she once ruled. As Marie Laveau's influence began to spread throughout New Orleans, it quickly became clear that her powers were not simply a matter of religious or spiritual practice. Her role transcended the typical boundaries of a voodoo priestess. She was seen as a figure who could not only heal but also protect, provide, and, at times, exact revenge. This mixture of compassion and vengeance, of miracles and curses, made her both a revered and feared figure in a city teeming with superstition and complex power dynamics. What made Marie Laveau even more enigmatic was that she wielded this influence with a remarkable degree of control, knowing precisely when and how to use her power to shape the course of events around her. For the enslaved, Laveau was a symbol of hope, a beacon of spiritual and practical support. In a world where the enslaved had little to no control over their lives, Laveau represented a rare opportunity to regain some sense of agency. Voodoo, which often involved invoking powerful spirits and ancestors to influence the world around them, gave these individuals a means of resistance, albeit an indirect one. It was not through physical rebellion or direct confrontation with their masters, but through the unseen, the supernatural, that they could exert some measure of control. Laveau was not simply a healer in the traditional sense, she was someone who offered them a connection to something greater than the confines of their brutal reality. She performed rituals to protect them from physical harm, healing them when they were sick, and providing them with charms or blessings to ward off misfortune. The rituals were as much about restoring a sense of dignity and purpose as they were about providing tangible results. The enslaved, stripped of nearly everything else, found in Laveau a sense of belonging and agency. They believed that she could communicate with the spirits of their ancestors, summon divine protection, and even influence the decisions of the powerful. However, Laveau's influence was not limited to those at the bottom of the social ladder. She was a bridge between the oppressed and the elite, able to straddle these worlds with astonishing grace and effectiveness. The white elites, who had once feared and demonized voodoo as a dangerous and subversive force, were soon turning to Laveau for help with personal matters. She was known to heal their illnesses, aid them in finding lost loved ones, and even intervene in matters of love and fortune. These individuals, who were in many ways the oppressors of the enslaved, sought Laveau's services as a means of control over their own lives. The powerful men and women of New Orleans were no less susceptible to the insecurities of life than the poor and disenfranchised. Their wealth and status did not shield them from loss, heartbreak, or despair. In Laveau, they found a rare source of comfort. It is said that she often provided them with talismans, charms, or even advice that would help them navigate the complexities of their own lives. This ability to help people on both sides of the racial and social divide made Laveau a figure who, while never openly challenging the power structures of the city, nevertheless wielded an enormous amount of influence. In this way, Laveau was able to maintain her position as a force to be reckoned with, balancing the needs and desires of both the powerful and the powerless. This extraordinary duality gave her a reputation that extended far beyond New Orleans. Travelers, adventurers, and even outsiders from across the globe came to the city seeking her out, drawn by the tales of her mystical powers and her ability to bring about miraculous changes in people's lives. Laveau's fame spread not just through the voodoo circles but also through the elite and religious establishments of the city. As her following grew, so did the stories about her, and with each retelling, her powers seemed to grow more formidable. But it was not only the spiritual practices that made Marie Laveau an icon in New Orleans. The rituals she performed were marked by an aura of secrecy and mystery. To the uninitiated, voodoo was a dark and ominous practice, something best left to the fringes of society. Yet Laveau's rituals were highly organized, conducted with a sense of purpose and structure that lent them an air of legitimacy, even to those who might have otherwise dismissed the practice as mere superstition. The secrecy surrounding these rituals was part of their mystique. Those who were invited to participate were often sworn to silence, their experiences carefully curated and designed to evoke awe and wonder. As a result, many outsiders came to view Laveau's voodoo practices as a sort of hidden power, one that existed in the undercurrents of New Orleans society, just out of reach of the law and the church. This secrecy also helped to protect Laveau from scrutiny and persecution. While the Catholic Church and local authorities were often at odds with her practices, the fact that her rituals were shrouded in mystery meant that they were difficult to fully understand or combat. The rumors that surrounded Laveau's practices grew as her influence expanded. Some claimed that she could control the weather, that she could curse people with a mere glance, or that she could communicate directly with the spirits of the dead. These stories were not just the product of gossip, they reflected the real power that Laveau held over the lives of the people who sought her help. It wasn't just about casting spells or performing rituals, it was about controlling the narrative of people's lives, offering them the belief that they could influence their futures through spiritual means. In a world where so much was beyond their control, where fate seemed like an insurmountable force, Laveau provided a sense of empowerment that was both seductive and dangerous. But as Laveau's power grew, so did the backlash against her. The fear that she could incite unrest among the enslaved, or even challenge the social order, became a real concern for the local elite. Voodoo, after all, was not just about personal healing, it was a deeply communal practice that spoke to the collective struggles of those who had been marginalized. The idea that Laveau could organize or inspire the disenfranchised to rise up against the system was one of the great fears of the white population in New Orleans. In this context, her growing fame could be seen as both a blessing and a curse. To her followers, she was a symbol of resistance, someone who could stand against the forces that sought to oppress them. To the elite, she was a dangerous figure who had to be controlled or destroyed. Despite the efforts to suppress her, Laveau's influence only seemed to grow. She continued to work with the people of New Orleans, both free and enslaved, performing rituals, providing guidance, and offering protection. But as time went on, the stories about her became more and more fantastical. Some claimed she could raise the dead, others that she had a pact with dark spirits. As her legend grew, so too did the divide between the historical Marie Laveau and the mythic figure that people believed in. This disconnect would eventually play a role in her erasure from history. Her power, however, was never simply about magic or the supernatural. It was about something deeper, an understanding of human nature, a recognition of the fragility of life, and the ability to give people something they desperately needed, hope. Her rituals, her charms, and her spells were not just tools for manipulating fate, they were a form of psychological release, an outlet for the deep fears and anxieties that plagued New Orleans residents. For both the powerful and the oppressed, Laveau was a figure who could help them make sense of a world that often seemed chaotic, unjust, and beyond their control. Through her influence, Marie Laveau became more than just a voodoo priestess. She became a symbol of defiance, of strength in the face of adversity, and of the power of belief. But as her influence expanded, so did the forces that sought to undermine her. The erasure of her legacy, the distortion of her story into myth and folklore, was in many ways a response to the threat she posed to the social order. In the end, it was not just her power that made her a target, but the fear of what she represented, an untamable force that could not be easily controlled or understood. As Marie Laveau's fame grew, so did the murmurings and whispers that filled the air of New Orleans. The streets, the markets, the taverns, all became places where the people would talk of her power, her influence, and the seemingly miraculous things she could do. While many came to her seeking cures for ailments, remedies for broken hearts, and protection against evil, others simply came out of curiosity, drawn by the mystique that surrounded her name. Some came to believe that the very fabric of their lives could change through her rituals and blessings. These stories were spread far and wide, and as word of mouth carried her legend beyond the bounds of New Orleans, the mystery surrounding her became even more pronounced. Laveau was more than a woman now, she was a living legend, a figure whose power extended well beyond the realms of reason. To the ordinary citizens of New Orleans, the mystery of Marie Laveau was amplified by her presence in the city. She was rarely seen in public without a veil or shawl draped over her head, adding to her aura of secrecy and elusiveness. Her rituals, often conducted under the cover of night, were said to take place in hidden courtyards or in the deepest corners of the city, away from prying eyes. No one knew for sure what went on behind closed doors, but there were countless rumors. Some claimed she could raise the dead, others said she had the power to curse anyone who crossed her. Her followers, who were loyal to her despite the dangers posed by those in power, were quick to defend her and protect the secrets of her practices. Yet, as with any powerful figure, her power was a double-edged sword. The more people turned to her, the more the suspicion of her grew. To the white elite, Marie Laveau represented an ever-present threat. They feared what she could do if she ever decided to lead a rebellion, or worse, if she united the enslaved and free people of color against their oppressors. Voodoo, in the minds of the ruling class, was something inherently subversive. It was a force that existed outside of their control, and it embodied everything they could not tame. While Laveau's followers found solace and strength in her practices, the elite feared that her influence could spill over into something far more dangerous. They feared not just the curses and rituals they had heard about, but the possibility of rebellion itself, an uprising that could disrupt the delicate social order they had worked so hard to preserve. Despite the growing fear among the elite, Marie Laveau continued to operate in the shadows, gaining more followers and securing her position as a spiritual leader. It was not just her ability to perform rituals that made her so powerful, it was her deep understanding of the psychology of power, fear, and belief. She had an uncanny ability to tap into the hopes, desires, and fears of those around her. Her presence in the lives of New Orleans citizens was a constant reminder that they were not entirely at the mercy of fate. With Laveau's guidance, they could alter the course of their lives, or at least gain a sense of control over the forces that seemed to govern them. Laveau's influence was also felt in the realm of politics, though it was more subtle than that of traditional political leaders. She had a way of steering the lives of those in power without ever directly challenging the established order. She was skilled at working within the system, using her position as a spiritual leader to sway the decisions of powerful men and women. Politicians, business leaders, and military officers alike sought her counsel, whether to improve their fortunes, protect their reputations, or ensure their political success. In many ways, she operated as a behind-the-scenes operator, influencing the fates of those who held the reins of power while maintaining her mystique. Her followers, both rich and poor, saw her as someone who could open doors and provide opportunities, sometimes in ways that were not entirely above board. This unique ability to navigate the complex, layered society of New Orleans only enhanced the perception of Laveau as a figure of immense power. But despite her growing influence, the people who sought her out for help were not blind to the darker side of her abilities. To many, the idea that Laveau could help them in matters of life and death, love and fortune, felt both incredible and terrifying. She was not a priestess who simply dispensed healing, she was someone who had the power to manipulate the threads of fate itself. The line between healer and sorceress was thin, and for many, it became difficult to distinguish between the two. For some, the lure of Laveau's power was irresistible. They came to her in times of desperation, seeking her aid for matters that seemed beyond the reach of ordinary solutions. They sought cures for illnesses that no doctor could treat, solutions to problems that no rational person could explain. It is said that Laveau often worked her magic in plain sight, but in a way that was disguised as something ordinary, simple herbal remedies, charms to ward off evil, and prayers that seemed no different from those of the Catholic Church. But those who had witnessed her work knew better. They knew that beneath the surface of her practices lay a force far more powerful than any conventional medicine or spiritual tradition. In contrast to the more rational world of the elite, Laveau's followers found comfort in her mysticism. They believed in the power of the unseen world, in spirits and forces that operated beyond the understanding of the physical world. Laveau, in many ways, was a bridge between the material and the spiritual realms. She provided them with a sense of hope, a belief that their struggles were not in vain and that they could gain some measure of control over their fate. This is why so many were willing to follow her without question. They believed in her, not just because of what she could do, but because she made them feel as though they mattered. In a world where they were constantly told they were less than human, she gave them a voice. She gave them power. Yet, the more Laveau became a fixture in the city's life, the more her existence became an enigma. As time passed, the stories surrounding her grew more exaggerated, and the line between fact and fiction became increasingly blurred. She was no longer just a woman, she was an embodiment of everything that the people feared and adored about New Orleans. To some, she was a symbol of hope and redemption, to others, she was a warning of the dangers of the supernatural. What remained undeniable, however, was that Laveau's name was now known throughout the city and beyond. Her legend had grown to the point where it was impossible to separate the real woman from the myth that had been built around her. This dichotomy between the myth and the reality of Marie Laveau's life played a significant role in her eventual erasure from history. The more she became associated with the supernatural, the less she was seen as a real person. In the minds of many, she transformed from a powerful voodoo priestess into a dark figure, one who could bend reality to her will but existed only as a shadow of the past. Her life became a story that was no longer grounded in fact, but in folklore. Her power, too, was reduced to the realm of legend, and soon it was as if she had never truly existed at all. The truth, however, is far more complicated. Marie Laveau was not simply a figure of myth and mystery. She was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, resourcefulness, and resilience. She navigated a world that sought to marginalize her at every turn, and in doing so, she forged a path that many others followed. Her story, while buried under layers of myth and superstition, is one that speaks to the struggles of those who have been erased from history, whose voices have been silenced by the forces that seek to control the narrative. As Laveau's story was relegated to myth, the true power of her legacy, her ability to transcend the barriers imposed upon her by society, was lost. In the end, it was not just her rituals that made her powerful, but the way she understood the world around her and the way she moved within it. As the years passed, the legend of Marie Laveau began to take on a life of its own. Though she remained a central figure in New Orleans, her role as a spiritual leader, healer, and protector became increasingly intertwined with the mythology of the city. The more she became associated with the supernatural, the more distant her true identity seemed to become. Her influence was undeniable, yet she became an enigmatic figure, a woman whose power seemed to grow not only because of her actions, but because of the rumors and stories that swirled around her. The mystique that enveloped her was a double-edged sword. While it reinforced her stature, it also obscured the very real woman behind the myth. By the early 19th century, New Orleans was a city on the edge of transformation. The Louisiana Purchase had expanded the United States, and the city's demographic and political landscape was shifting. The French and Spanish influences were being overshadowed by American ideals, and as the city grew, so did its complexities. It was no longer just a place where European empires had clashed and then coexisted, it was now a microcosm of the burgeoning American South, with all its contradictions and conflicts. The institution of slavery was entrenched in the region's economy, and racial divides were widening. Yet, it was within this very tension that Marie Laveau found a space for herself, building not just a following but a power base that defied easy categorization. At the heart of Laveau's success was her uncanny ability to adapt to her surroundings. While she was a symbol of resistance for the marginalized, she was also a fixture within the social fabric of the city, accepted and even respected by many of the white elites. This was, in part, due to her skill in navigating the complex racial politics of New Orleans. She did not solely rely on the tradition of Voodoo, she blended it with elements of Catholicism, ensuring that her rituals were seen as both familiar and foreign. She was not a strict adherent of any one belief system, but instead a practitioner who moved seamlessly between worlds, spiritual, social, and political. In a city where the African diaspora had a profound influence on the culture and daily life, Voodoo was seen by some as an act of defiance, a rejection of the Christianized values of the French and Spanish settlers. Yet, Laveau did not make a clear break from Catholicism, rather, she incorporated aspects of it into her practices. This blending of the two religions made her an even more compelling figure, as it allowed her to appeal to a broader audience. Catholicism's strong presence in the region created a veil of legitimacy around her work. To outsiders, her use of saints, altars, and prayers might have seemed like a fusion of the sacred and the profane, but to those within the practice, it was a seamless blend of the old and the new, a system of belief that spoke to both the visible and invisible worlds. Her rituals were a way of bringing the power of the unseen into the visible world, and the people who followed her saw her as a conduit between these realms. But what made Laveau's power truly remarkable was her ability to maintain control over her followers without ever seeming to do so explicitly. She understood the human desire for certainty, the need for hope in a world that often offered very little of it. Through her rituals, her prayers, and her curses, she gave the people of New Orleans the belief that they could control their fate, or at least influence it. Her ability to promise something greater than the mundane world, something beyond the limits of everyday life, allowed her to exert a powerful hold over those who sought her aid. Despite the growing interest in her practices, Laveau was never fully accepted by the Catholic Church or the city's political establishment. The Church viewed her as a dangerous influence, a woman who threatened the moral fabric of New Orleans. Church officials, like many of the city's elite, saw her rituals as a form of rebellion, a way of undermining their authority. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, Laveau's ability to blend Catholicism with African spiritual practices was nothing short of heretical. Yet, despite the Church's condemnation, Laveau's popularity only grew. She was seen by some as a saintly figure, someone who could heal the sick, protect the vulnerable, and provide comfort in times of despair. To others, she was a dangerous woman whose powers threatened to destabilize the social order. The fact that she was a woman of color only added to the complexity of her role. In a society where racial and gender hierarchies were strictly enforced, Laveau was a contradiction. She was a woman who wielded power and influence in a world that sought to limit the agency of women, especially women of color. She was a spiritual leader in a time when women were often relegated to the private sphere, and a political force in a society that viewed women as second-class citizens. Yet, she found a way to rise above these limitations, to carve out a space for herself that was both powerful and influential. This defiance of the societal norms was not just an act of rebellion, it was a statement of survival, a testament to her resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet, for all of her power, there was always the undercurrent of fear that surrounded Laveau. The very people who sought her out for help and healing were the same people who whispered behind her back, casting shadows on her reputation. Her abilities were not simply spiritual, they were rooted in the fear that she could undo the lives of those who crossed her. Stories circulated about how she could curse her enemies, how she could call upon the spirits to exact vengeance on those who wronged her or her followers. This duality, of being both revered and feared, was what made Laveau a compelling, almost mythical figure. To her followers, she was a source of empowerment, a protector who could see beyond the material world. To her detractors, she was a force to be reckoned with, someone whose very presence was a reminder that they were not entirely in control. As the 19th century wore on, Laveau's life began to be overshadowed by the mythic tales that had been built around her. The line between fact and fiction became increasingly difficult to discern, and soon, her reputation as a powerful voodoo priestess overshadowed the reality of her daily life. The more the stories spread, the more disconnected she became from her own legacy. By the time of her death in 1881, Marie Laveau had been transformed into a symbol of dark power, an icon of New Orleans' supernatural lore. Her life, with all its contradictions and complexities, was distilled into a series of tantalizing myths that could no longer be disentangled from the truth. The myth of Marie Laveau, however, was not something that disappeared with her passing. If anything, it only grew stronger. As New Orleans moved into the 20th century, Laveau's legacy was preserved not just by those who still practiced voodoo but by the many who sought to understand the city's strange and mystical history. In the years following her death, her name became synonymous with voodoo itself, and her life was reimagined in countless books, films, and stories. Some depicted her as a woman who could control the very elements, others portrayed her as a kind of sorceress who could alter the fates of those around her. In both cases, however, the real Marie Laveau, her struggles, her resilience, and her power, remained largely hidden beneath layers of myth and folklore. It is this disconnection between the woman and the myth that continues to fuel the mystery of Marie Laveau's life. Despite all the stories, the rumors, and the tales of her powers, the truth remains elusive. What did she truly believe? What were the personal motivations that drove her to wield such power? Was she truly a force for good, or was she simply a woman who used the tools at her disposal to survive in a world that sought to destroy her? These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is what has allowed her legacy to endure. In a world where facts are often obscured by time, the story of Marie Laveau is one that refuses to be fully understood. The mystery of who she was, and what she represents, remains as potent as the legend itself. As the legend of Marie Laveau continued to unfold in the cultural fabric of New Orleans, the city itself began to take on an almost mythical quality. The streets, the bayous, the neighborhoods, and the very air of the place seemed imbued with an eerie resonance, as though the forces that governed fate had been permanently altered by her presence. New Orleans was a city of contradictions, a place where the spiritual and the earthly, the supernatural and the mundane, coexisted in a delicate balance. And at the heart of this delicate equilibrium was the figure of Marie Laveau, who had learned to master the art of navigating these realms. Her power lay not only in her rituals or in her spiritual practices, but in her ability to manipulate the social and political forces around her. Though much of her life remains shrouded in mystery, there are certain aspects of her existence that stand out with clarity. One of the most enduring aspects of Laveau's legacy is her ability to bridge gaps between races, classes, and spiritual beliefs. In a time when the world around her was rife with tension and division, she seemed to defy the boundaries that others were constrained by. She was not bound by the same limitations that most women, particularly women of color, were forced to endure. Her work, her life, and her very identity made her a symbol of resistance to the rigid structures that dominated the lives of the disenfranchised. Despite the growing animosity from the ruling class, who were fearful of her power, Marie Laveau continued to build a legacy that was both spiritual and political. It wasn't simply her skill in the art of divination, or her ability to communicate with the spirits, that made her an influential figure in New Orleans, it was the fact that she understood the dynamics of power in a way few others did. She knew how to manipulate the forces of the city, both human and supernatural, to her advantage. This was the key to her success. By combining her spiritual expertise with a keen understanding of the political landscape, she was able to position herself as a vital figure in the social fabric of New Orleans. Laveau's ability to operate within the world of the elite, while maintaining her ties to the marginalized and disenfranchised, speaks to her extraordinary adaptability. In many ways, she was a figure who could traverse two worlds at once, the world of power and privilege, and the world of poverty and oppression. She was a healer and a protector for the enslaved and free people of color, yet she was also sought after by the wealthiest citizens of New Orleans. The elites came to her not just for cures or blessings, but for a sense of reassurance in a world that was as unpredictable as it was oppressive. Laveau's ability to ease their anxieties, whether real or imagined, made her indispensable to those in power. But this was also the very thing that made her such a complex and controversial figure. For the elites who sought her out, she was a necessary tool, a means of preserving their status and their wealth. For the oppressed, she was a symbol of resistance, a woman who had defied the odds and become a beacon of power in a world that sought to keep her and others like her down. And yet, as she navigated these two contradictory roles, Laveau was able to maintain an air of mystery, keeping her true intentions hidden from both sides of the divide. While much of Laveau's influence came from her ability to bridge these social gaps, part of her power also lay in the secrecy surrounding her work. Her rituals were deeply private affairs, often conducted under the cover of darkness in hidden corners of the city. This air of secrecy only served to deepen the sense of mystique that surrounded her. In a city as steeped in superstition as New Orleans, the unknown was a powerful tool. The more mysterious she became, the more her reputation grew. People spoke in hushed tones about the extraordinary powers she possessed, her ability to heal the sick, to predict the future, and to curse those who crossed her. Her name became synonymous with both divine protection and dark retribution. She was both a savior and a destroyer in the eyes of those who believed in her power. However, it was not just her spiritual abilities that made her such a feared and respected figure. Laveau's keen understanding of the human psyche and her ability to manipulate emotions also contributed to her dominance. She knew how to play on the fears, desires, and insecurities of the people around her, whether they were enslaved or elite. She understood the importance of hope and how to provide it when people were at their lowest. She also understood the power of fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the supernatural, and the fear of retribution. She used these tools to create an environment in which people felt both empowered and controlled by her. She was not just a figure who gave people what they wanted, she was a figure who made them feel as though they needed her in order to survive. The sense of dependence she cultivated among her followers was part of what made her so powerful. By convincing people that their futures, their fortunes, and their very lives depended on her, she was able to create a network of loyal followers who would defend her, promote her, and keep her name alive long after she was gone. It wasn't just about her individual power, it was about the system of belief she created, a system that gave her followers both agency and submission. They believed in her because they had to. They believed in her because they were convinced that their lives would be nothing without her. But this power came at a cost. The more Marie Laveau's influence grew, the more she became a target. To the elites who feared her, and to the Catholic Church that sought to discredit her, she became a symbol of everything they despised. Her practices, seen as pagan and subversive, were a direct challenge to their authority. They feared what she could do if she ever united the oppressed and turned their energies against the established social order. The fact that she operated in the shadows, so closely tied to the margins of society, only made her more dangerous in their eyes. Yet, despite the efforts to suppress her, Laveau's legend only grew. The stories surrounding her were amplified by the very fear that she inspired. Over time, the distinction between the real Marie Laveau and the mythic figure became increasingly blurred. As her power seemed to transcend the physical realm, the line between truth and fiction faded. To the people who sought her out, she became a larger-than-life figure, someone whose influence extended far beyond the realm of possibility. It was as though she had entered the realm of the divine, her earthly form giving way to something greater, something supernatural. This mythologizing of her life only deepened the mystery surrounding her. While her followers continued to swear by her powers, to declare that she had cured their diseases, helped them find lost family members, or protected them from harm, there was no concrete evidence to support these claims. The very fact that her practices were shrouded in secrecy made it nearly impossible to distinguish between the reality of her work and the exaggerated stories that were told in hushed tones. To some, she was a saintly figure, a healer who performed miracles; to others, she was a witch, a woman who trafficked in dark magic and curses. Even after her death in 1881, Marie Laveau's legacy lived on. She became a central figure in the mythology of New Orleans, her life and work reimagined by generations of people who wanted to believe in the supernatural power that she had embodied. Over time, her name became synonymous with voodoo itself, and her image was embraced by those who practiced the religion. Her grave in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 became a place of pilgrimage for those who sought her blessings or wished to honor her memory. People continue to visit her tomb, leaving offerings, prayers, and tributes, convinced that her spirit still watches over the city. Marie Laveau's ability to transcend both time and space, moving from the realm of the living into the world of myth and legend, speaks to the lasting power of her influence. Her life, though filled with contradictions and complexities, has become a symbol of defiance, resilience, and spiritual power. Despite the attempts to erase her from history, to reduce her to a mere figure of superstition, her legacy endures. In a world that often seeks to suppress the voices of the marginalized, Marie Laveau's story continues to resonate, a testament to the enduring power of belief, the mystery of the unknown, and the resilience of the human spirit. As the mystery surrounding Marie Laveau deepened, so did the complexity of her role in New Orleans. Despite her power and influence, she was always something of a paradox, straddling the line between the sacred and the profane, the revered and the feared. Her story is not just one of supernatural acts and spiritual guidance, it is a tale of survival and defiance in the face of a society that sought to erase her very existence. In many ways, Laveau's legacy is as much about the world she inhabited as it is about the forces she fought against, forces of inequality, oppression, and racial division. At the core of Marie Laveau's power was her ability to navigate the intricate web of New Orleans society. The city, with its colorful mix of cultures, had long been a place where the line between the spiritual and the mundane was thin. Its French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean influences created a unique cultural mosaic, where African slaves brought with them their own belief systems, and Catholicism, though dominant, was often intertwined with other practices. Voodoo was not only a religion for many in New Orleans, it was a living force that could be wielded by those who understood its mysteries. For the disenfranchised, particularly the enslaved Africans and their descendants, it became a means of survival, a way to assert some control over a world that sought to render them powerless. Marie Laveau, as both a practitioner and leader of voodoo, offered something that was in short supply: agency. For those who felt powerless in their daily lives, whose fates were often decided by people who saw them as little more than property, Laveau represented hope. She provided a connection to a spiritual realm that was not just about faith but about action. Voodoo, as practiced by Laveau, was a tool that could change the course of events in one's life, whether through protection from harm, the healing of sickness, or the granting of love and fortune. But her power did not stem solely from the rituals she performed, it came from her profound understanding of human psychology and emotion. In a society that sought to maintain rigid social hierarchies, Laveau's ability to move between the various strata of New Orleans' population was remarkable. She was able to connect with the poor and enslaved while also gaining the trust of the city's elite. White New Orleanians, who had once feared the African spiritual practices of voodoo, began to see Laveau as a source of comfort and security. They came to her not only for the mystical services she provided but also for the sense of control she offered over a world full of uncertainty. Despite the racial and social divisions that defined New Orleans, Laveau was able to serve as a bridge between these worlds, offering something that transcended race and class. In a city where racial boundaries were tightly policed, she was a force that could not be easily categorized or controlled. Yet, despite her success and influence, Laveau was never fully embraced by the institutions of power. The Catholic Church, in particular, saw her as a threat to its authority. To the Church, Laveau's mixture of Catholic saints and African deities was heretical, a form of syncretism that undermined the pure teachings of Christianity. But Laveau was not interested in following the rules set out by any single religion. She understood the power of symbolism and ritual, and she used both to her advantage. Her ability to blend elements of Catholicism with African spiritual practices gave her an air of legitimacy in the eyes of her followers, while also allowing her to maintain a distinct identity. This ability to navigate multiple belief systems made her even more enigmatic, both a figure of piety and of power. In the eyes of the enslaved population, Laveau was more than just a spiritual leader. She was a protector, a figure who could shield them from the brutalities of their daily lives. The systemic violence and injustice that defined the experience of slavery in New Orleans were never far from the minds of the enslaved. Laveau offered a form of resistance that was subtle yet powerful, a resistance that was not based on open defiance but on the ability to survive and, in some cases, to turn the tables on their oppressors. In her rituals, the enslaved found a way to challenge the power dynamics that kept them bound. Her influence, both mystical and social, allowed them to feel as though they had some measure of control over their fate, however fleeting. But the influence of Marie Laveau was not limited to the enslaved. Her relationship with the white elite of New Orleans was just as complex, if not more so. As New Orleans grew into an increasingly prosperous and cosmopolitan city, the demands of its wealthiest residents shifted. The elite began to look for ways to maintain their dominance in an increasingly unstable world. And in Marie Laveau, they found a figure who could provide them with the kind of reassurance they craved. Whether it was through healing a sick child, providing a charm to ward off bad luck, or offering guidance on a personal matter, Laveau became a trusted confidant for many of the city's richest citizens. Her services were not limited to just the poor or the oppressed. She had learned how to work within the system, using her knowledge of the human psyche and her spiritual expertise to secure her place in the circles of power. Her ability to balance the competing demands of the poor and the elite was a testament to her extraordinary skill and adaptability. On one hand, she was seen as a spiritual leader and healer by the oppressed, a beacon of hope and a symbol of resistance. On the other hand, she was revered by the wealthy and powerful, who sought her counsel and protection. This duality in her role allowed Laveau to exert a remarkable amount of influence over the course of events in New Orleans. Though she never openly challenged the established social order, her very presence represented a challenge to the status quo. Her influence, however, did not go unnoticed. The more powerful she became, the more the city's elites sought ways to neutralize her. Her ability to control the fate of individuals, to curse or protect, made her a dangerous figure in the eyes of those who held the reins of power. It wasn't just her ability to heal or protect, it was her ability to manipulate the unseen forces that governed the lives of the people in New Orleans. In a city steeped in superstition, this gave her an unparalleled advantage. The very fact that she operated outside of the control of the city's established power structures made her both a threat and a necessity. As the 19th century unfolded, Laveau's role in New Orleans became increasingly vital, yet her ability to remain elusive and mysterious also contributed to the fear and suspicion that surrounded her. The more she became associated with Voodoo, the more she became a symbol of something that could not be controlled. This growing mystique was compounded by the rumors that circulated about her powers, stories of her ability to curse, to summon spirits, and to raise the dead. These stories only fueled the belief that Laveau was a figure beyond comprehension, a woman who had transcended the limitations of the human world. The very secrecy surrounding her rituals only added to her legend. While some of her followers knew the details of her practices, much of what she did remained hidden from the outside world. The rituals she performed were often held in private, in secluded locations, and those who attended them were sworn to secrecy. This air of mystery contributed to the growing belief that Laveau's power was boundless, that she could control the very fabric of reality itself. The more people whispered about her abilities, the more she became a figure that could not be easily dismissed. But in the end, it was not just her mystical powers that made her a symbol of strength and defiance. It was the way she was able to survive and thrive in a society that sought to suppress her at every turn. Through her intelligence, her resilience, and her understanding of the forces at play in the world around her, Marie Laveau became an iconic figure, one whose legacy continues to echo in the streets of New Orleans. Her life was a testament to the power of belief, to the ability of individuals to rise above the limitations imposed on them, and to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Marie Laveau's influence was never fully understood in her own time, and it continues to remain something of a mystery to this day. While the myths surrounding her have only grown with time, the reality of her life speaks to something far deeper, an enduring power that cannot be easily erased or forgotten. Through her actions, Laveau transcended the world in which she lived, leaving behind a legacy that continues to resonate across generations. In the end, it is not the rituals or the stories that define Marie Laveau, but the indomitable will and spirit that she embodied, a force that lives on in the very soul of New Orleans. The life of Marie Laveau did not end with her death in 1881, rather, it became the foundation upon which legends would be built for generations to come. Her passing, while marking the end of her earthly existence, did not diminish the power she had accumulated in life. If anything, it solidified her as a figure of myth and folklore, one whose legacy was far greater than the sum of her earthly deeds. The city of New Orleans, with its reputation for mysticism, superstition, and intrigue, seemed to absorb Laveau's spirit into its very fabric. Even in death, she became a symbol of the supernatural forces that permeated the city's culture. Over the decades, the stories of her life and work took on new forms, constantly evolving as they passed from one generation to the next. Marie Laveau's grave, located in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, became the site of pilgrimages for those seeking her blessings or simply hoping to honor her memory. It is said that people still visit her tomb, leaving offerings such as coins, flowers, and notes in the hopes of receiving her protection or guidance. These rituals, though rooted in tradition, are also a testament to the enduring belief in her power. Despite the passage of time, Laveau's legacy remains deeply ingrained in the cultural consciousness of New Orleans. Her name has become synonymous with voodoo itself, and her image has been woven into the city's rich tapestry of folklore and myth. But Laveau's influence did not merely persist through the rituals performed at her grave. It became a part of the very fabric of New Orleans' identity. The city, with its blend of French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean influences, was already a place of contradiction, where the boundaries between life and death, reality and the supernatural, were often difficult to distinguish. Laveau's legacy only heightened these contradictions. Her story, her practices, and her power blurred the lines between the ordinary and the extraordinary. She was not simply a historical figure, she was a living, breathing part of the city's mythos, someone who seemed to embody the very essence of New Orleans itself. In the decades following her death, Marie Laveau became the subject of numerous accounts and interpretations. Historians, writers, and folklorists attempted to untangle the truth of her life from the myriad of myths that had grown around her. Some saw her as a saint, a revered figure whose healing powers and spiritual guidance had earned her a place in the hearts of many. Others, particularly those in positions of power, viewed her as a threat, a woman whose influence had been built on the fear of the unknown and the power of belief. But despite the varying perspectives on her life, one thing remained clear: Marie Laveau was a force that could not be easily categorized or confined to a simple narrative. Her story became as much about what she represented as it was about the reality of her life. To the African American community in New Orleans, she was a symbol of empowerment. In a time when people of African descent were often relegated to the margins of society, Laveau's rise to prominence was a testament to the possibility of resistance. She had navigated the complexities of a deeply divided society, finding a way to carve out a place for herself and her followers in a world that sought to suppress them. Her ability to transcend the social and racial boundaries that defined her time made her an icon of defiance and resilience. In the eyes of her followers, she was a living example of how one could find strength in the face of adversity, how one could wield power in a world that was determined to strip it away. But even as Laveau became a symbol of empowerment, there was another side to her legacy. As New Orleans entered the 20th century, the city began to change. The old world of French and Spanish influence was gradually replaced by a more modern, Americanized vision of the city. The social structures that had once allowed Laveau to operate with relative autonomy began to shift, and the very forces that had elevated her to prominence were now in decline. This shift in power dynamics meant that the myths surrounding Laveau would no longer serve the same purpose. They were no longer just stories of spiritual guidance and resistance. They were now a way to preserve the old ways, to hold on to a sense of identity in a rapidly changing world. In the early 1900s, as New Orleans entered a new phase of urbanization, Laveau's image began to be romanticized in ways that had not been seen before. Writers, artists, and filmmakers began to incorporate her story into their works, often painting her as a mystical figure whose power transcended the physical world. This new narrative around her focused less on her practical influence and more on her role as a symbol of the supernatural. It was in these representations that the myth of Marie Laveau truly began to grow. She was no longer just a woman who had healed, cursed, and guided people through the challenges of life. She had become a supernatural being, a spirit whose influence was not bound by time or place. The more her story was retold, the more distant the reality of her life became, until she was transformed into something more ethereal, more fantastical. This shift in how Marie Laveau was perceived was a reflection of the larger societal changes occurring in New Orleans. As the city became more modern, it began to grapple with its own cultural identity. The rise of the tourist industry and the increasing influence of mainstream American culture meant that the old, vibrant traditions of New Orleans were beginning to be seen through a new lens. The city's unique blend of cultures, its history of mysticism, and its association with the supernatural became key selling points for tourists, who flocked to New Orleans in search of the exotic, the strange, and the mysterious. In this new economy, Laveau's story became a commodity, a symbol of the old New Orleans that was disappearing in the face of modernization. At the same time, the portrayal of Marie Laveau as a supernatural figure began to blur the lines between history and folklore. The more her story was told, the more it was infused with elements of mysticism and the occult. Her powers, which had once been seen as grounded in spiritual practices, were now depicted as more otherworldly. She became a figure of legend, a woman whose ability to control fate and manipulate the unseen forces of the world was beyond the comprehension of mere mortals. The real Marie Laveau, the woman who had lived, suffered, and fought to build a life in a world that sought to destroy her, was eclipsed by this mythic figure who seemed to exist outside of the constraints of time and space. This mythologizing of Laveau's life is perhaps one of the most significant ways in which her legacy has been preserved. While the reality of her life may have been clouded by time, the myth of Marie Laveau continues to captivate the imagination of people both in New Orleans and around the world. Her story is now an integral part of the city's cultural identity, woven into the very fabric of its history. She is no longer just a historical figure, she is a symbol of the city itself, a representation of the mysticism and resilience that define New Orleans. Even as her power and influence have been obscured by the passage of time, the stories of Marie Laveau continue to be told. They are passed down from one generation to the next, evolving and changing with each telling. Her name is invoked by those who seek her protection, her guidance, or simply a connection to the mysterious forces that govern the world. The rituals that were once performed in secret, in the shadows of New Orleans, have now become a part of the city's public life, embraced by those who are drawn to the allure of the supernatural. Yet, despite the myths and legends that continue to grow around her, it is important to remember that Marie Laveau was a real woman, a woman who lived, loved, and struggled against the forces that sought to oppress her. Her legacy is not just one of magic and mystery, it is one of resilience, survival, and defiance. In the end, the mystery of Marie Laveau's life is not just about the rituals she performed or the supernatural powers she wielded, it is about the ways in which she challenged the boundaries of her time, navigating a world that sought to erase her very existence, and emerging as a figure whose impact would last for generations. Marie Laveau may have passed from the physical world, but her legacy endures. It lives on in the stories that continue to be told, in the rituals that are still practiced, and in the hearts of those who continue to believe in the power of her spirit. Through her, New Orleans has preserved its connection to the mystical and the mysterious, ensuring that the woman who once walked its streets will never be forgotten.